Hello, everyone. I'm Stephen Robinson, and today I am happy to have Michael Mora, my colleague. We have sort of a special bonus chat today because there's been so much uh, comic book, sci-fi, fantasy, political nonsense lately, so that we've joined
Yeah.
forces to kind of discuss some of it from our own perspective. Like, really, Black Mermaids caused people to lose their minds. It's I don't I'm trying to comprehend what's happening there. So um uh
Yeah.
yeah, so for those who fortunately, I would like to say fortunately have been avoiding this kind of craziness, um Disney is part of their kind of bleeding any sort of blood, financial blood from this creative stone, remaking past movies, are remaking The Little Mermaid, and they cast a black woman, Halle Bailey, tragically probably named after the actress. She was born in 2000, so
hmm
it is not unlikely that her.
Which people got confused online and started tagging Halle Berry.
Yes,
So
that's a swordfish mermaid. I would have seen that movie twice. So
most of us would.
but the so she's black. What was interesting was that when she was first announced, there was a sort of more polite whining about it being, oh, well, it's not racial. It's just that Ariel was meant so much to, I named my daughter Ariel, and it's about redheads, and redheads are so few redheads or stars. And so, of course,
Of course.
not sort of like epic trolling, this, the new Little Mermaid does have red hair. And now it's just no, 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 it's not that. It really is that she is black, and black fictional character. Because mermaids, I just to spoil this for people, mermaids don't exist. So everyone is very like people, and Matt Walsh had gone on about the science of mermaids, and not only did he get the science wrong,
Which is
but
already a bad start.
he
The
later
science
claimed
of
that
mermaids.
he was just sort of being trolling liberals by being an idiot, which, okay, you showed us. But so what is this really, what do you think this is really about, Michael, other than obvious racism?
It's obvious racism. Like there's really no there's it's a lot of people trying to reverse engineer excuses to why they're being racist about it. Because I've seen people online like, oh well, it's about like you said, it's about redheads, and then some person like posted an infographic of all these characters that were red canonically that got cast as black actors or with Latinx or whatever. And my thing was is that they tried to make an infographic, but they had to keep repeating the characters. So they put Jimmy Olsen from Supergirl twice and Nora Allen from The Flash twice. It's like you couldn't even have enough examples to make your infographic, and you have to double up. And it's the Little Mermaid. Like it's amazing to me watching people like Geeks and Gamers and Matt Walsh and the Quartering and all these people online that are online reactionaries bring the same type of energy and fire that they bring to Star Wars and Marvel whenever they want to complain about those things on the Little Mermaid. Like my guy, like I'm the first generation millennial. Trust me, you are not a Little Mermaid fan growing up. Like as a young kid, like most boys in general were fans of like Aladdin or Pinocchio, some of the classic ones, and that's why Marvel bought, or that's why Disney bought Marvel, and they bought Star Wars as like IP because they realized that they had the market cornered with princesses and fairy tales, but the boy market was, with these action heroes was like kind of like lacking. So they bought these IP. So for to watch somebody like Matt Walsh sit there and act like he was such a huge fan of The Little Mermaid in the '90s, it's like I'm sure you saw it, everyone saw it, but nobody was you weren't going to bed holding a My Little Mermaid plushie going to sleep, Matt. So let's not pretend. Um, and then the thing is the science of mermaids, like, and he even went so far as like, well, she should be translucent and like with pupilless eyes, and you know all this like creatures from the deep sea. I'm like, gee, I wonder why Disney then cater their remake of a fantasy movie for children as horrifying undersea monsters. Like,
Yeah. Well, it's
like
not as if it's sci-fi. Like Ursula is literally a witch, so like the entire plot line is rooted in magic, and these are obviously magical. I mean, she's not a mad mermaid scientist,
mhm,
and it's not some sort of sci. It's not, obviously there's not much sci-fi
in fairy
Star Trek
tales.
or so whatever,
Yeah,
but Star Trek would have like, oh well, here's some sort of scientific explanation for why the crew is now turned into spiders or something like that. But here it's just magic. So it's clearly I
it's fairy
remember
tale magic. It's
when
Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale, and even in that fairy tale, like she was described, I think, with like green skin. You know, when she makes her deal, her legs are split, and then she's like walking on knives. And at the end, spoiler for the original, the prince doesn't marry her. She goes into the ocean and she turns into sea foam, and it's
yeah.
the saddest tale ever. We want
Well,
to be
it's a
originalists. We could do this, but there's a reason why Disney whitewashes and like takes the edges off of these fairy tales to make them palatable for children.
well,
Like the
yeah,
original
it's a
Pinocchio,
Twilight.
scary,
It's a Twilight Zone episode originally. Like she makes a bad deal and pays the price for it, and then
of
Rod
course.
Serling narrates over the sea foam. Um,
Exactly.
There's a lot. I remember. I mean, Matt Walsh. It's clearly he alluded to what is referred to as sort of the white genocide concept, like anything that is whiteness, minorities are taking away. And he's
Right.
not new in this. He's relatively young. He's in his mid 30s, but I think when he was almost 30 years ago, when Star Trek Voyager came out and they cast the character Tuvok was a black Vulcan, and people were like, well, there are no black Vulcans. I'm just like, how, really? Like a whole planet? There are no black people on this planet? It's like, well, when we saw, remember when he went to Vulcan in that episode, and there were no other black people there, and it was like, well, that was Spock's wedding, and I mean, that could just be an issue with Spock's family, or why he has no black
I
has
mean,
no black friends. It happens, but I don't
when
think we would discuss, we would go to anyone's wedding as a proof of the, you know, ethnic diversity of that planet. Does not seem the most logical. Um, so to that point, like Matt Walsh brought up, um, Black Panther and how unfair, they could do that, but obviously, so and that's the core of all conservative, like this inherent
right,
victim complex that the world is geared towards minorities and to liberals, um, despite all evidence, because we ain't winning, but fine, and that
right,
we are, they could get away with, we could get away with this, but they cannot. Um, and I think that led to something you and I were talking about earlier, which is just, well, that's kind of, Walsh is sort of close to getting the concept of white privilege or a white dominated culture without comprehending it. So, like, black characters in literature have almost always had to, and Hispanic or any person of color
hmm,
has had to justify their existence.
right,
So, T'Challa is literally an African king. Even Robbie Robertson, when they introduced him in the comics, I mean, you could adapt Spider-Man and have a black actor play J. Jonah Jameson and say basically the character's a blowhard and Robbie Robertson is the more grounded character. But even in the comics, they were very clearly, when he introduced his son, it was very much about, there were stories geared around his race.
right,
And they don't really do that with white characters. Like Spider-Man is a kid is a nerd who got bitten by a radioactive spider. There's no reason why that character could not be any
right,
other race, and they have trouble comprehending. So that's why it gets ridiculous for the stuff with the mermaids, because they don't. And it's not a sense of that there is no white culture, because they're even saying, well, these are Hans Christian Andersen, he's European, and they're stealing from European culture, and it's like, well, no, because you came and took us. So your European culture is very much now including everyone the British Empire touched. So,
Right.
saying that James Bond, for example, is inherently white and European, similar to like Black Panther, is actually not true, because the core of that character is that he's a British secret agent. Not all British people are white. The British
Right.
Empire made a point of that. So he could be someone of South Asian descent, or any,
Hmm.
or Black, or anyone who
Right.
is like when they talked about Idris Elba, who grew up in England. And what would happen is that they would then say, oh, well, he can't because there's an inherent whiteness to the character. And what they're talking about is power and privilege, not
Right.
like how James Bond worships. Like, it's not like he's Jewish,
Right.
or it's not like, there are all these stories about, in certain ways, of like Hispanic culture, of like just like the foods that they cook, or the
Right.
way that they celebrate certain holidays or anything. No, James Bond is essentially a blank slate, and what they're extending as being whiteness is privilege. And so what are your thoughts on that idea of like whiteness essentially privilege is what they're actually saying?
Right. Well, it's this thing where, for the longest time, media made it, because of who had the power to create media and who had the power to create, stories. It's inherently had white as the default. So
Hmm.
you had, the reason that you had a lot of these characters is, let's say, James Bond. So Ian Fleming is white. He wrote about a white character because that's who he was familiar with at the time. It's probably why some of his novels and even some of the movies adapted for him are so problematic when they have to deal with characters of color or other cultures. So, but now if you're adapting this to today, you have to also bring in what is Britain today. And, in that case, it could be anybody who's British because, like you said, James Bond inherently is a double O agent spy for MI6. It doesn't matter, his race. That was never made a
Mhm.
default, probably because it was inherent. It was one of these things where they just assumed, but back then, that the default would be white. And
Yeah.
a lot of this, they don't get that. That's probably why they never specified the race, is because they just
Mhm.
assumed default, and that's part of white supremacy, and that's why
Yeah.
these characters can now be adapted to other races. Whereas T'Challa is not just an African king, because they're going to say, well, they're South Africans and they're white and all this. Yeah, but he's specifically an African king from an isolationist country
Mhm.
whose entire thing is that they're Afrofuturists because they were never colonized. That kind of narrows down what kind of African
No,
king he
no,
could
the
be.
blackness is sort of key there. And
Right,
I remember there was some blowback when uh Perry White was cast as a black actor in the Batman v Superman
right,
film. And again, sort of the Daily Planet was as very, very white in the 40s, like,
right,
very early on. And as time progressed, so you had the dynamic where Peter Parker, the Daily Bugle newsroom, is inherently more diverse than the Daily Planet, but they're existing technically in the same time. So when you
yes,
would make a modern movie, it just sort of, well, this is very unnaturally white, and there's no
right,
reason to kind of keep to that. That was sort of the challenge of the Fantastic Four. And they would try to say, oh, well, let's set it in a Mad Men past. And the only reason they sort of sometimes cling to that is because of sort of that's the only way to sort of rationalize a lot of the inherent whiteness. But again, whenever someone describes Sue Storm, um, Johnny Storm, or Reed Richards, and Ben Grimm has been canonically Jewish. But aside from
hmm,
the other characters, anything that you say of that would be inherently white winds up kind of revealing certain prejudices, like, oh,
right.
well, Reed is very smart. Sue is sort of the ultimate MILF. And it's like, okay, well, that could be any. Um,
Johnny Storm is
the
famous and in, celebrity. Like, why? It's
Yeah.
like, and nowadays the famous celebrities are, there are white actors and famous white celebrities, but there's a lot of celebrities that are Latinx and people of color, and men and women. Johnny Storm could easily just be Jane Storm because that's the culture that we live in. Some of the most famous people are Cardi B or Megan Thee Stallion or Ariana Grande. So why wouldn't Johnny Storm be a female character? You could do that too. Um,
When the
I think.
first FF movie came out, and they cast Jessica Alba
Mhm,
as Sue Storm. John Byrne, who had written the FF for a while,
sure.
objected to casting, um, and had commented online that it was not racist, but here's where you're
Yeah.
always. But whenever he see Hispanic women wearing blonde wigs, they seem like prostitutes to him. I think everyone needs a moment with that. They
Yeah.
were-
Well, it's just hard. As a as a as a as a Latino man, I can tell you that La- Latinx or Latin women have all color of hair, red hair, black hair, brown hair, blonde, you name it. Also, every pigmentation known to man. So, this idea of like that's because again the culture that's because the same white culture that was basically whitewashing everything and making the default be white was also whenever they gave you a character that was Latinx or black, they had to be the most stereotypical version of that.
Mhm.
So the Latin characters always had a very nice tan, and they all always had an accent that they could never shake away, no matter what. And they all were red, hot blooded or very sexually promiscuous or very, open with their sexuality. Which I'm not going to say that Latin people aren't, but at the same time, like that's not the default. Like we come in all types of different ways, which is, you know, how it is when bigots try to like it's what happens when people who don't have diversity around them try to make characters that are diverse. They end up becoming stereotypes. um
Yes. And
with
so that character being kind of sort of like the joke of like, oh, Frasier is an inherently white show. And you would say, well, why? Like, I could easily, it's just essentially a dynamic between sons who are very different and perhaps
mhm,
more cultured or whatever than their more traditional father. That's a dynamic that exists in all cultures.
sure,
You could do a reboot of an Hispanic Frasier or Black Frasier, and if you're thinking that the only that instead of Sherry, we'd be opening Colt 45s or something, is more
right,
revealing of yourself than anything else. I mean, same with like Superman, who's literally an alien. They would
mhm,
say there's an inherent white. Well, what is white about him? What is white about like? There are Kansas farmers who are black. There are, it would actually be interesting if the Kents were of a different, seemingly of a different race than
sure,
Superman, because that would essentially what is happening. They're adopting someone who's very different. But they would always kind of, well, he's the big Boy Scout. It's like, oh, well, what did that mean? What does that mean about
right.
what? So his inherent, you know,
Goodness and
goodness
and
and
his,
whatever
yeah,
you are coding is very white and could
right.
not be anything else. You would, well, Superman is kind of a square, and he wouldn't be sort of like cool, and he's not Miles Davis. It's like, what? Like, so stuff like that is very
Have they
revealing.
met Ben Carson? Like I mean, and Ben Carson's as conservative as can be, but he's also like a very square and uncool guy. Like I mean, we have we have those on in every race. Like it's and like you have what kills me about the Matt Walsh thing when they're talking about, oh, what if we made Black Panther into a white guy or we made Storm into a white woman? You're forgetting that up until very recently, that's exactly what was happening in all of these movies and all of these TV shows. John Wayne was Genghis Khan. Othello was played by Olivier. Like you had Jake Gyllenhaal in the early 2000s was the Prince of Persia. This is they just did what was it the Gods of Egypt with Gerard Butler and the guy who plays Jamie Lannister as Osiris and Horus, the gods of Egypt. Like the whitewashing has happened for decades, for years. It hasn't really stopped. It still happens now. You have Scarlett Johansson playing, the main character Ghost in the Shell, who's is Japanese. So this still happens to this day. So this thing of like, well, imagine if this happened, dude. It's been happening. It's always happened. The thing is that fans of fandom and geek culture and these fantasy and sci-fi stories just had to make do. In order to enjoy the stories, we just had to either accept that the default character was always going to be a white guy, and then put ourselves in the character by saying, yeah, he's a white guy, but hey, if I was in this situation, I would do the same thing that Peter Parker would do.
Oh yeah.
Or vice versa. Or we had to live with the fact that we're watching Laurence Olivier play Othello, and or we had to watch multiple characters get whitewashed, right? And we had to just live with the fact that the only way we're going to tell this story, or the only way we're going to get a Genghis Khan story, or we're going to get this story about this, any type of diverse story, is to basically have a white actor basically do ethnic face for whatever the ethnicity.
And I know when I was a kid, when Transformers would come out and we'd play, they would say like the kids in South Carolina were like, okay, well, you can't be Optimus Prime, you can be Jazz. It's like, well, they're robots, and
but his name is Jazz.
But I have to play Jazz. I have to play Scatman Crothers,
right?
Crothers' character.
I can only play salsa or mambo.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the only two I could play.
The very ethnically coded Transformers, and then yes, very ethnically coded. But also on GI Joe, there was Roadblock, who spoke entirely in rhyme, and I remember
and he was the cook.
I wanted to ask the writers, you understand that we don't speak in rhyme? Like, he might be shell shocked. Like, he might have a serious mental condition.
Exactly. Well, and
and then it's only speaking
but
in
nobody
rhyme.
says a thing when The Rock eventually plays Roadblock in the GI Joe movie. So it's amazing to me where they draw these fictional lines in the sand about adaptation, and how the word is, it says it right there. It's an adaptation. You're adapting something. If you want the exact thing, you go back to the original text or the original, show or TV. I mean, Neil Gaiman has said that millions of times, like, oh, they butchered, they destroyed your story. And Neil Gaiman just points at his, books and goes, no, they're right there. I can just, whenever I want, pick up my book and I can read it. And Sandman's exactly how I made it back then, but this is an adaptation. And that's the other one where you had people trying to yell at Neil Gaiman, who adapted his own story, telling him he did it wrong. Like, because he cast death as a black woman. It's death. It is a metaphysical concept that's personified into a human being. And then they started yelling about, well, what if Dream was black? And then Neil Gaiman had to literally post panels from the comic book, because Dream has been every ethnicity too, including a black man. It's like, oh, gee, imagine. And, that's why the example you gave earlier about the Daily Planet, it's inherent of when these characters were created. So the reason that the Daily Bugle is more diverse is because Marvel Comics started in the 60s. So even though they were very white in, their characters, they still inserted more diversity because of the time that they were incepted. So you had Robbie Robertson, you had James Rhodes being best friends with Tony Stark. You had all these characters that were diverse, in the beginning. Not that they didn't have problems, because they still had Fu Manchu and, characters like that. And the Mandarin had to go through extensive adaptation to make it even palatable in the Shang-Chi movie. But, they were doing better, obviously, than DC Comics, who started in 1938. And, over time, they've gotten better with adaptation. They've gotten better with, changing things. But, and it's funny, you have, again, where do you draw the line? So you don't get mad when Nick Fury got recast, because it's just like the comics, except the comics were the Ultimate Comics, who adapted Nick Fury from the white guy Nick Fury to Samuel L. Jackson Nick Fury. There was a little bit of a hubbub, but because at the time it was just the comic book fans just, had the hubbub. By the time we got to the movies, nobody batted an eye that Samuel Jackson was playing a character that looks like himself.
Samuel L. Jackson was already a big star.
Sure.
So it's kind of like they're just seeing Samuel L. Jackson. They're not seeing but I'm sure the racists had an issue with this or whatever. I mean, you talked about adaptation. I think a lot of adaptations, with what makes sense over time, you like what's important about the character. So the character like Daredevil, is it important that he is white or whatever? I mean, arguably what's important is that he's Catholic. His dad was a boxer. He grew up in a very working class, hard neighborhood. Now, when he was created, or even when Frank Miller was writing him, he would have been someone who grew up in the 1960s in Hell's Kitchen, a very Irish American, still somewhat of a slum neighborhood. And so that whiteness, battling Jack Murdock being white, would make sense. Now you could say, well, if this is what I find very compelling about the character, maybe a Hispanic from the South Bronx who is also very Catholic,
right,
and is from a neighborhood that is not where hedge fund managers lives. I mean, that's Hell's Kitchen now. It's somewhere that can connect to, that's the story I want to tell. And that's not sort of being woke. That's just sort of, oh, these are things that's interesting. And it would make kind of more sense, shift it this way.
Well, that's what Brian Michael Bendis did with Spider-Man. So when he created the Miles Morales version of Spider-Man for Ultimate Spider-Man, first he killed off Ultimate Spider-Man, which was already kind of like, a ballsy move, but you could do that in a separate imprint. But he said, if a character right now, a kid from Queens, got bit by a radioactive spider and got spider powers, what would he look like? And for him, a kid from Queens would be a half black, half Puerto Rican, Afro-Latino kid who got bit by, and then other than that, it's the inherent things that Spider-Man has. He still has family trouble. He still has school problems. He still has to deal with, the superpowers and the villains and all that. Because Spider-Man as a character can be any race. In fact, the Into the Spider-Verse makes a big deal of making the core tenet of the movies that anyone can wear the mask. It's probably why a lot of people, a lot of Latinos and Black people really love Spider-Man, because he is a character that immediately, because he's fully covered, at no point do you even have to pretend that, anyone can wear a Spider-Man costume, and until you remove the mask, everyone looks exactly like Spider-Man.
Oh yeah. And I think some folks have commented, I mean, granted it was 1999 and there's probably some potentially pushback on this, but there was a missed opportunity with Batman Beyond, because Terry McGinnis could have easily been Black or Hispanic,
of course, given
the background. Also, he wears a full face mask, so a lot of that would work. Batman is Bruce Wayne's one of those characters as well, who we've discussed. People come back to, and I think Mark Bernard and the Kevin Smith podcast had said that he had agreed with your point that the kind of inherent aristocracy of the Waynes in Gotham that's been described, that makes him that makes sense that Bruce Wayne is white. But again, that is not sort of cultural. And I think that's a schism politically, because I think people don't want to sort of acknowledge or concede white privilege. So what they're saying is like, oh, well, a Clark Kent who encounters racism growing up, even though he's an alien, is fundamentally different. Like he needs that privilege. Like a Clark Kent who's been racially profiled, is he still going to be our Clark Kent, who is sort of oblivious to a lot of that? That sort of essentially what they're talking about is a sort of a political ignorance, a cluelessness. I mean, the TV show Harley Quinn has a lot of fun with Bruce Wayne is completely disconnected. And one reads an episode, or is it people pay for housing? Or little Bruce Wayne is asking Harley Quinn that.
Which in the show, the show's embracing the inherent thing of Bruce Wayne being this guy with white privilege who's from old money and has benefited from generational wealth. I
Mhm.
agree that you can make Bruce Wayne a character of color. I think the thing that you run into is because of inherent generational wealth and racism that you have to decide how many generations the Waynes have been part of Gotham. Okay, because
Mhm.
if the Waynes have been around as long as Gotham's existed, which is what most people, then inherently they were around, you know, during slavery, during some of these
Oh yeah.
bad things, and they benefited from that. Whether maliciously or unmaliciously, whether they were abolitionists or they weren't, they still benefited from being in the system that privileged white
Oh
men.
sure.
Um, if you're making Batman only go, 2 or 3 generations, I mean, there's an inherent thing where, you know, unfortunately, because of history, there's a period of about 1619 till about like 1970, 80, where
Mhm.
people of color were just disproportionately disadvantaged. So the ability to have generational wealth, to accumulate the wealth that is inherent in Bruce Wayne, to be billionaire playboy Bruce Wayne and be,
Mhm.
Batman, it depends on where you want to start the character off.
Sure.
Can you
Well,
start
I
the
mean,
character?
he could be a billionaire. I mean, as we discussed,
Of
Lucius
course.
Fox, who's a CEO or even just a C-level executive, if
Mhm.
Bruce Wayne's giving him good stock options or whatever, he could be a billionaire, and his
Of
son
course,
could be a billionaire.
which
But
is
again,
different.
he's been presented as aristocracy,
Right.
in Gotham aristocracy,
Right. The
and I
Prince of
think,
Gotham.
and the Prince of yes, it's Prince of Gotham, like uh, just very quickly, what I really liked about Batman, Beyond, was that when they go to a future where where Batman is retired, um, it's not as sort of it hasn't degenerated into a crime-ridden horror show.
Right.
But the problem was that Derek Powers, the sort of the bad guy in the first season,
Mhm.
has taken over. He's taken over Wayne Enterprises, and you see the impact of a essentially sort of malignant king,
Mhm.
malignant king of Gotham, and that is what kills Terry. Like Terry McGinnis's father isn't shot in an alley; he's shot because he crosses a corporate executive, and
Right.
so it's a very sort of the sense of the power of that wealth is the issue, and I think that's fascinating to me. So the idea of like that is inherently white, but to your point, when a lot of folks have objected to the 69 Project sort of talking about making black people seem as victims or making that concept, they're often the same people who would then say, wait a minute, this is so unrealistic that your black Bruce Wayne has all this generational wealth and
Right.
that his ancestors or that the whole town, the name is black. Also, of course, because Bruce Wayne could be black and the Wayne family could still have started with
Of
white. I
course.
mean, there's just
Because
one, you only need a couple generations of a Wayne marrying. In fact, Martha Wayne could be black, and there you
well,
go.
you don't even need the Waynes
That's the
marry.
quick.
I mean,
It's Lily White until Thomas Wayne marries Martha. Bam, and then you've
well,
got
and the unfortunate reality is that because of slavery and white supremacy back in the day, when black people were freed from slavery, their surnames were often the surnames of their slave masters at that time. So you could have a character who's Bruce Wayne now, and it still goes back to a slave owner because
mhm.
at some point when he was freed, he just was, you know, he was Bruce Wayne's ancestor, but he was. So you can make it work. I just think that
Oh
for
yeah,
when and this is what it's funny. It's like they don't want to accept that there's generational wealth and that the 1619 project, and there was all this disparity. But like you said, as soon as it's time to adapt the character, they will admit to that disparity and that inherent
mhm.
history of racism and this ability of having generational wealth kept from people of color in order to justify why the
Sure.
character should stay white. Um,
But
there's another
a
thing.
sort of Barack Obama Bruce Wayne, who essentially
Sure.
is just one generation, quote unquote, black, is in a way fascinating, right? Like then it's
Yeah.
sort of
Well,
what.
and that's I think in a character that I mentioned to you off air was Jace Fox, which is Lucius Fox's son,
Mhm.
who is currently Batman, and the title was Future State, the next Batman, and then he's in his own title, I am Batman, and the story is very compelling because it actually talked about generational wealth and it talked about race. Initially, the character has a Batman costume, but he has the mouth area covered, fully covered, which is the thing you were saying about Terry McGinnis's full body suit. Nobody can tell what race he was on. And at the end of the book, he decides to uncover that piece because to him, he wants to be Batman, but he wants to make it clear that he is a black man who is Batman. He
Mhm.
doesn't want, he hid it initially because he knew the inherent racism and bigotry that would happen. Some people have speculated online, and some communities have said that part of the reason why Batman keeps that is so cops don't shoot him because they know that it's inherently a white guy.
No,
You
I'm
know,
okay. Don't
yeah, I'm
worry.
okay. I'm a
I'm a
vigilante,
good
but don't shoot me.
vigilante.
See, white guy
Um,
on my chin. Um,
but
and
I want to talk to you about a lot of the abuse you've seen online of these folks because people are worried about Halle Bailey and
mhm.
what happened with Moses Ingram and then the gentleman who played Finn and Star Wars, where
John Boyega.
yeah, his experience with Star. He's someone who he's not that much younger than well, probably very young. I think he's maybe 30, so pretty much younger than I am.
He's in my age range, sort of.
But he's someone who grew up with Star Wars, who loved Star Wars, and
Mhm.
then got this role and sort of was exposed to sort of the worst element of the fandom. And I think a lot of folks, and when defending Moses Ingram, um, Evan, it was sort of McGregor was sort of like these aren't real Star Wars fans, and it becomes sort of unfortunately a true Scotsman's theory because, well,
Mhm.
unfortunately, the fandom does include they're buying the stuff, they're seeing the movies. It includes
Sure.
a you know a pretty toxic element in what we've seen. We've seen it in superhero comics and comics. It's an irony because it seems counter to. It's not just like fans of Rambo or John Wayne westerns. I mean,
Yeah.
it seems something that you would feel is inherently um inclusive or
Mhm.
has a more positive message, but a lot of bad actors have latched onto it. But the
Right.
abuse has been um pretty repulsive. Like, can you talk about some of what you've seen most recently
Sure.
from folks?
Well, with John Boyega specifically, it's this weird arc where initially, he joined Star Wars because he was a fan of Star Wars, and then as soon as he was revealed, as one of the main cast of Star Wars, he had to deal with this backlash from racist fans and that dark side of fandom that has always existed in fandom. It's just always kind of been below the surface, and then eventually it became this thing where when it was time to then harass another person of color, in this case Moses Ingram, all of a sudden those same racists that gave him a hard time when he was making his movies all of a sudden used him as an example of why no, we weren't racist. Look, John Boyega was in the Star Wars movies. We had no problem. It's like, no, you had a problem. We have like history, and some of it is genuine racism. Some of it, I think, it's also YouTube and the way that the internet has almost incentivized people being their worst selves. Some of these people, um, for example, there's a guy named Jeremy Greggs from Geeks and Gamers. When The Last Jedi came out, initially he said he liked it, great fan. And then once he realized that the algorithm was skewed better to uh, hate it and to lob, as much harassment as possible about the movie, they just kept hitting that button like a mouse in an experiment, just hitting the button to get a treat. And the YouTube algorithm basically rewards people like that to keep making this toxic content. So you'll have like 500 videos against Brie Larson or Amber Heard or Moses Ingram or Kelly Marie Tran or Daisy Ridley. So, so part of it is the incentivization. If they don't get incentivized, it's
Mhm.
part of it, they give up because, there's no reward to continuing to do that. And some of it is just genuine racism. When they were talking about the Little Mermaid, you had another online personality uh, put a picture of Ryan Gosling superimposed in somebody else's body, saying the George Floyd movie. Like, George Floyd is not a fictional character; he's a real human being who died tragically, and you're mocking his death and what the ramifications of that were, and you're making a bad faith comparison that's
Mhm.
racist on top of it to compare a real life human being to a fictional mermaid
Yeah.
character or to T'Challa. Um, like you
No,
said,
I mean, no black person was cast as Prince Charles or Diana on The Crown, or
the
and
only example they could possibly point to of something like that would be Hamilton, where the entire premise of the show is that you've cast all the founding fathers with the most diverse cast possible.
Mhm.
That's one, though. And it was done as the premise of the show. It wasn't done like this is historically, this is exactly what it looked like. Alexander Hamilton was Lin Manuel Miranda. Like, no, the entire premise of the show is what if we gave you the history of Alexander Hamilton and the founding of this country, but we did it with a diverse cast and using what were floor speeches and debates as rap battles.
Mhm.
So that's not the same thing. And like you said with adapting character, you notice that they never bring up characters like James Rhodes as why can't James Rhodes be white? Well, because if you make James Rhodes white, he's just Tony Stark. Because he's War Machine. So if you make a white War Machine, I mean, that's why he was, and John Stewart. Why can't John Stewart be white? Because a white Green Lantern is Hal Jordan, Kyle Rayner, Guy Gardner. You've got all these choices for white
Mhm.
Green Lanterns. You can
And
let people
and
have
I
a
would
black Green
say
Lantern.
I would if you wanted to cast a white person as Rhodey and then focus on what you believe in the MCU in the modern day, the true conflict is more of the grounded military person
Sure.
compared to the sort of, freewheeling Tony Stark,
Right.
and then say, oh, we're going to cast Kerry Washington as Pepper Potts or something, and we're going to do diversity in different ways. That's certainly
Perfectly
the
fine.
compelling
Yeah.
argument or idea of like, oh, well, why don't we try to
If you're
where it's
doing it,
not
yeah.
just
If
a
you're
reaction to this, it's sort of we're going to look at where we can find diversity in different ways or find things that are compelling. I mean, that's what the story is. You were talking about Hamilton again, to bring up John Byrne, who his takes have always been quite insane. He was very adamantly against Hamilton because he thought it was going to give a, a a negative reading of history that people, essentially kids who aren't, they aren't like teaching them Hamilton, but they would somehow come away thinking the founding fathers were not white. Um,
My kids know more history because of watching Hamilton than they do from school.
it's just an
Like,
absurd. It's just such an absurd argument. But I mean,
you learn in school about King George and the Revolution, but like that is like a week or 2 weeks of lessons, and then that's it. It's like very pared down, and you don't really learn much about King George other than he was very mean, and that's why we just wanted to be independent. And yet you watch Hamilton, and you get this idea of like the hint of like King George being mad King George, and then that sparks curiosity. With my kid, it sparked the curiosity of finding out why is he kind of crazy, and then you find out about the madness of King George, and you find out that he was going through all these things around this time of the show Hamilton, but in history. And now he knows more about King George than
that's
he
good.
probably should,
Yeah.
which is inherently what you want from stories. You want to inspire people. You want to make people remember your stories and come back to them. That's the whole point of art and the point of art as commerce. If you have somebody buy a ticket one time and then never come back, you made the money one time, but they're never going to come back.
I
So
think one of John Byrne's other takes that was just still he had written one of the which goes crazy plot lines in the late 80s, early 90s, and I think he'd rooted it on the fact that he believed Wanda was inherently unstable and insane because she fucked her vibrator, quote unquote. Because
because of the vision.
he's just fundamentally unable. He just refused. He had the same issue with Data from Star Trek. Like, it's just a thing, which at the time you're like, well, you're sort of missing a key element here. And then later you would see some of his arguments about trans people, and you're like, oh, right, you're very reductive thinking. So of course that would go back to your fundamentally like, why would anyone risk their life for the vision? That's just a machine. It's like, well, no, like, and that argument that comics were making about what life is or what life matters. The slight digression, but Byrne had an issue or a pattern in his work of like not getting certain like, well, obviously Alicia should be with Johnny Storm. Why would she be with the monster? Or why would he would always sort of not get certain kind of, well, this is actually the kind of what's compelling or what is beautiful about this storyline. And that, yes, the Vision is just as much a person as everyone. I think
Right.
I think he had described himself in one comic as a person with a every part of him was a prosthesis, which is interesting. Like, he's still, because his
So
humanity is
right,
whatever it's in.
but then that tells me John Byrne somehow views a person with prosthetics as somehow less of a human,
Yeah.
because people don't choose to have prosthetics.
Mhm.
Sometimes you're born with missing an arm, or you're born with missing an appendage, and you have to have a prosthetic. Sometimes it's because you've been to
Yeah.
war, or you've had
Well,
an
I think
accident.
the original comparison of that, when, and it wasn't a Byrne comic that said this, when he's saying this, is the idea that a person is not, your humanity is not defined by your human parts per se, right? So the
Hmm.
Vision is someone less human because one arm is a prosthesis or whatever. Like, the
Right.
Vision is not the Vision, what makes, same with Data or same with others. And I think that becomes the big debate that we've seen with the trans debate, with when people want this very reductive, well, what is a woman? Why can't you define what a woman is? Or why can't you define what a man is? There has to be a very specific type, well,
Well, it
and
has
I
to
think
be very
that
specific, and it has to be the specific
exclusionary
that
too.
that the person wants to be, the specificity that the person wants, like you said, to be exclusionary. Because we ran into this issue when we were talking about in the early 2000s about gay marriage. What is marriage? Is it one man, one woman? Well, this is since historically. Well, if we're gonna go historically, marriage has varied a lot
Mm.
historically. There were people who had multiple wives. There's people who had multiple husbands. There's polyamory. There's people who just got married for political gain, be it as alliances, or just as in order to have truces. Dads married their daughters off in order to trade property. Like, marriage is not this, defined historically as one thing. It has evolved over time to what it is now, which is, for the most part, it's a union of two people who love each other. And the government has decided that we will create a contractual agreement to this, so that the people that are in this agreement that love each other could benefit as a couple
Mhm.
and this union contractually, which is why we have marriage licenses, and divorce is a legal precedent, not just something that happens in the church. And that's why your spouse inherits things like that. We're running into the same battles again with the trans fights, and we're running in with race, because the same people, every time that they lose a cultural battle, they just decide to pick a new target, and then
Mhm.
they will beat that target down. And if they win, what they will do is, once they win the trans battle, and you see it now, then they start going back to gay people, because we beat the trans people based on the arguments we were making. So now regular gay people are now groomers and pedophiles and things like
Mhm.
that. And then that begins again. And then they're hoping that they win that battle, then they can go down the line.
Oh
What
yeah.
was the next cultural battle we lost? Well, black people are groomers and Hispanic people, and then eventually, and it's all this regressiveness to go back to what was originally the problem,
Yeah.
which is why we have this problem with media and culture, and why you're losing your mind that the default is no longer white, is that there was racism, there was white supremacy, and as we've evolved, we've become more diverse, so our stories naturally have become more diverse.
Oh, exactly. To tie that back into the whole thing, because our folklore or legends and whatever, and even who you worship. I mean, culturally, if you're talking about a very small culture, small that is, homogenous, that makes sense. That their stories represents themselves, and I think that
Sure.
in America specifically, so much of voluntary, like they chose to bring black people here, and they chose to, and it's not like Hispanic immigrant. I mean, they chose to invade what was then Mexican territory. People were always like, look, dude, it was, no white person called it Los Angeles. It was, like this is
the,
like this
the
is like
Spanish American War is the reason that you own Puerto Rico as a pseudo colony, and to this
mhm.
day, it is still in a colonial state where it is not a state, but it's not its own country, and we're living in colonial rules. Even Gorsuch, Justice Gorsuch, who by all accounts I should disagree with mostly, in one of his dissents about a case involving a Puerto Rican citizen who moved from New York back to Puerto Rico, and was saying, why am I not eligible for my Medicare and Medicaid benefits that I am entitled to as an American, just because I moved from New York to Puerto Rico, which is considered U.S. territory and is part of the U.S., and I'm still a citizen. I didn't lose my citizenship. And, in his dissent, he wrote that eventually we have to decide what we're going to do with Puerto Rico because we're living in this colonial state. Well, that's, Puerto Rico didn't decide all of a sudden to
No.
be the spoils of war when you won the Spanish American War. And we didn't decide that we would be a colonial territory and you would play these games with how we are. But this is how it is. And because
Yes.
we're citizen, we are, that's why when we move to the mainland US, we are granted all freedoms and all rights as American citizens that we were born with.
So
So
the
you made
whining
us
you
this way.
hear from these
You can't
folks,
complain that then we exercise the
yeah.
same rights that you gave to us and that you inherently conquered us for.
Oh, exactly. And
You didn't
the
want
the
Puerto Ricans. You
whining,
didn't have to. Yeah, you didn't. You don't want black people. You don't
yeah.
want Hispanic people. You didn't need to colonize us and take over our
Yeah,
places
like
and
that's all
assimilate us.
voluntary. That's all voluntary. And the if you turn on Fox News, it would be as if black people and Hispanic people, Asian, like everyone, specifically black people and Hispanic people, are flooding here against. And this is just a very minding your own, all white nation, and that we're coming and
Right.
taking, which wasn't happening. Like you brought black people here, you colonized Hispanic, either from Mexico and Puerto Rican lands. You took that as your own. Those people were here. Their culture was here. Specifically, their culture was there. Because this is like Texas, again, is not just cowboys. That was Mexico for a very
Texas,
long time.
California, New Mexico, all of
And
that
this is our
Southwest.
play. And so obviously, what they're talking about when they talk about this invasion is not what they initiated. What they're talking about is just that we're demanding sharing the folklore. So yes, if you make us celebrate Christmas, maybe we will imagine that Santa Claus is black. Sorry, Megan Kelly, and maybe Disney, which is a huge part of American folklore. Maybe the Little Mermaid will be black, and King Triton will be a Hispanic, and these will all be things that
Or
reflect
Namor.
the diversity of the world. Yes, and Namor as well. And obviously, the idea that mermaids can't be black, unfortunately, as absurd as that is, there is a sort of political link to culturally these stereotypes of black people not being able to swim, which was not true. It's just that white people made it almost impossible for us to swim because you actually
Right.
need access to public pools and beaches to do that. And they
Right.
made sure that we did not have access. I think even Hispanic people as well.
Right.
So,
Redlining the neighborhoods that you were built in were these neighborhoods that did not have, like you said, access to the water. You had basically you were landlocked. So the only access you had to any type of water was a pool on an off day when white people would decide that from this hour to this hour you can swim, and then we'll just disinfect it after you leave, and then the white
Mhm.
people can then enjoy, the pool that they paid for. And even then, if a white person came and decided I'm going to swim that day, you know, all the black people would be kicked out,
Yeah.
and that would be the case.
So
And
there's something I think kind of cool about both in Little Mermaid and then soon in the Black Panther Wakanda Forever that people of color, black people and Hispanic people of color, of descendant are kind of freely like of the waters. These are our waters. It's not like this
right,
hidden all Greco-Roman land. Like it's not just that white people dominates in the land and the sea. It's like, oh no, we actually there are black mermaids, and there's the Atlantis called a
have
new
they not
name.
been to
This
Cancun?
undersea
Right.
culture would be very much Mayan influenced, and because why not? And I think
Why
that
not?
is
I
scaring.
mean,
That is what scares them.
I mean,
Um,
Central America, you have Cancun, you have all these beautiful beaches. Like we have beaches. Puerto Rico is an island. I was surrounded by beaches. I was, this concept of like water is this weird thing that only white people can swim in. It's even more foreign to me just being born on an island because there was no way you could never see the ocean if you didn't want to, especially the size of Puerto Rico as an island. So, you know, and it's just uh, it's it's so much to try to deal with this sometimes and try
yeah.
to like rationalize why it's happening and then explain why the changes have happened the way that they have.
Mhm.
um you
Well,
know
I'm glad you took the time to chat with us about
sure.
this and gone on. We're almost in an hour, but I think we there's so much more. We'll go. I mean, I'm sure someone will say something also absurd about it. It is, we joke about our interest in these things being kind of it's all escapism, right? And escapist art
Hmm.
and so forth. But it's fast, like it's been so politicized. It has become this so big to the point of just this ridiculous movie because it is just a ridiculous cash grab from Disney,
Right.
and it means a lot to. I don't want to discount how much it means a lot for women of young girls of color to see a black Ariel or whatever. But the fact that that it's something that people are finding this offense to the point where they're trying to turn her into a white person is just nuts. And as someone who's one of my best friends is a very pale redhead, she actually doesn't actually go to the beach unless she's wearing a spacesuit because she will catch fire.
Right.
So the idea Ariel like hanging out, like I mean, it's
Yeah.
maybe the Black Mermaid. Let's give the Black Mermaid her due. So
Right.
thank you, everyone. Michael and I will be back at a later date for some more, I'm sure, Matt Walsh mermaid science.
I mean, Wakanda Forever comes out in December. I'm sure that this conversation is going to keep going because I think the right wing has learned that media and art is an empathy machine. And, you know, if you allow people to see diverse stories or see people that are different than you as equal than you and having the same experiences and the same emotion, it's kind of hard to then hate them fully. And that's what they don't want. They don't want people to realize that black people, Latin people, Asian Americans were all technically having these same experiences, you know. So they're going to keep fighting these cultural battles because if they lose there, then obviously they're going to lose politically and in every other way because it's kind of hard. We had with gay people, you had Will and Grace, and once people realize gay people aren't scary, they aren't trying to like groom everyone, and they're not trying to rape everyone, that they're just like you and me, then it was much harder to oppose gay marriage. It was much harder to oppose trans people. They still do it, but it's much harder fight to do when people can see with their own eyes, this diversity and what it really means. So we'll continue having these fights. Unfortunately, we'll continue having to have these conversations.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone. See you soon.